the recording? Okay. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to see everybody here tonight. My name is Laura Wakefield. I'm the program coordinator for NCHE, the National Council for History Education. Tonight, we are so pleased to bring this important conversation on mapping inequalities to you. If you're not familiar with NCHE, we host a variety of professional activities for anyone interested in history and how we teach it, including webinars, colloquia, professional development. We have an annual conference, online trainings, and like tonight, a conversation with noted historians and history educators. And you can find out more by going to www.nche.net, or you can follow us on social media. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome a good friend of NCHE and one of our distinguished advisors, Professor Ed Ayers. And you might want to switch that slide if you want to for the next one. Ed Ayers has been named National Professor of the Year. He received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama at the White House. He served as president of the Organization of American Historians and won the Bancroft Prize for Distinguished Writing in American History. Ed served as the founding chair of the board of the American Civil War Museum, and he is host of The Future of America's Past, a television series that visits sites of memory and meets the people who keep those memories alive. He is the executive director of New American History, an online project based at the University of Richmond, designed to help students and teachers to see the nation's history in new ways. His most recent book is Southern Journey, The Migrations of the American South, 1790 to 2020. We have two people fortunately presenting tonight. So our second guest is Annie Evans, and we are delighted to have her here. She's the Director of Education and Outreach for New American History at the University of Richmond. Annie is a National Geographic Society Grosvenor Teacher Fellow, a Nat Geo Certified Educator and Trainer, and co-coordinator of the Virginia Geographic Alliance. Geography is in her blood. With over 30 years of classroom and educational leadership experience, she designs curriculum and facilitates professional learning for K through 16 teachers and museum educators, focusing on historical thinking skills, geoliteracy, instructional coaching, project-based learning, and performance assessments. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Ed and to Annie.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with everyone. I started to say it's great to see everyone, but I want to be honest with you, I'm not, but it's great to be with you. We really look forward to hearing your questions and learning from you tonight. As you heard in the bios, this is something called New American History. And the basic idea after teaching American history for 40 years, I decided that it'd be great if it were more interesting. And so this is using as many techniques as we can think of to connect with students in many different ways. You know, we're ready to talk about tonight because New American History is meant to address the reasons that young people should care about history, the way that we all live in history all the time. So if you go to newamericanhistory.org, you'll see this page. You'll see a new little essays that I write every once. This one's my provocative statement that history doesn't follow formulas. And you can see we have a number of sessions on women's suffrage this time. This has changed at a regular pace. And you'll see there's different components to it. So Annie's going to show us how we can, if you go to it and explore, you can see that as you're thinking about the classes that you're going to teach, there's different ways to examine the various things that you would look at. And I know it's going to change here any moment. So you click on menu, and what it does, it brings up that you can explore by era. And so you're thinking, oh, today I've got to do the progressive era, how am I going to do this? And it arranges things. And in all of these topics, there's an array of media and sources that allows you to explore it. This is one of the things we'll be talking about later tonight. You see it goes all the way up to the present and all the way back to the first contact. You can also explore by location. So that we know one great way to get students involved in their education is to show them history actually happened where they live. And so all the different sources are geolocated through this means as well. And then you can also explore through, we're going to see, by edition. And so what you just saw there was an edition where we pull together things from the different media that we're going to show you here in a moment, and all the teaching resources that Annie has put together. So that I have some credibility with you, just let me say that Annie is actually an experienced teacher, not just somebody like me who teaches college and talks about it. I was on the NCHE board as an active member, now distinguished. That's one of those great academic words that means I don't actually have to work anymore. But when you go to New American History, which is changing all the time, this is what you'll see. So, and as we think about this evening, what we want to do is to have Annie talk about how we might use some of these resources to actually be of use in your classroom. That's the whole point of all this, is that I understand how many demands and pressures are on teachers of history, teaching different classes. So we're trying to build things that make it easier to do a really good job. And Annie's going to talk a little bit about how we do that.
Okay, and I hope you guys can hear me. I apologize. I was having some technical difficulties. So Ed, give me a thumbs up if my sound is working correctly. Okay, so before we get started, this is kind of a slide that I like to remind myself when I'm working with teachers, kind of why we're doing this. And so I'm not going to read this to you. You have the bit.ly on the first slide, and we'll make sure that you get that, or maybe Laura could even put that in the chat for us. It was on the first slide. But as I'm sitting down to create slides like this, whenever we're doing a presentation, or as I'm working on learning resources or piloting those in classrooms, these are sort of the questions I ask myself. And a lot of them are ones that I've asked myself over the years as a teacher. So if those are helpful to you in any way, or if, you know, tomorrow or next week you're thinking about this presentation, I hope you still will be thinking about it as you're planning for the new year. These are just some things to think about that are kind of, to me, a guidepost for the work that we're doing at New American History.
So in New American History, there are several distinct partners that will be useful in all the things that you teach. We are going to talk about mapping inequalities specifically, but we thought it'd be useful to give you a broad overview. This is Bunk, which is named after the Henry Ford quote that history is more or less bunk. And it's sarcastic since we know that history is not more or less bunk, and it changes every day. It's a real-time curation of representations of the American past in all media. And so we have over 5,000 entries. And as you click on any one of them, this is about the movement to capitalize Black. You can click on any of the pieces, and it links in to lots of other articles that are related to that. So the idea is that your students can go on their phones and begin exploring something that's in the news today and see all the different ways through the different tags that it relates. So they can also on their phones make a collection of what they think are the 3 best articles about this. So it's a way to connect the bridges between current events and history, and to show how that students the history is being made and created every day. And there is a lot, as you can see on this is today's page, a lot about race and issues of inequality. And because a lot of this is growing out of issues of journalism and so forth that are meant to be current. This captures what I call ambient history or free range history, to try to show young people that history isn't just the stuff captured within their textbook, but is living around them all the time. So that's a way to see this. The next tool is one of our other partners, and one we'll be talking about quite a bit tonight, is American Panorama. This is a digital atlas of American history. And one of the things that I've discovered teaching is that young people can see the patterns in some ways more easily than they can imagine them through reading. And so we've made a whole series of maps. The one that Annie's showing you now is the forced migration of enslaved people. And it tracks basically the domestic slave trade. Areas on this map you can see that are blue are where the number of people are decreasing. So here in the 18 teens, massive numbers of people being sold out of the Chesapeake and being sold into new parts of what's going to become the Cotton South. You can see large white areas there are where areas that are still possessed by the Creek and the Cherokee and the Seminole, the Choctaw and Chickasaw. And so and on the right, you can see with our integration of STEM techniques, bar charts that gives you some sense of scale, and bubble charts. Each one of those is a county. So you can study what we're talking about tonight, mapping inequality back to its very origins with the birth of the nation and the domestic slave trade. American Panorama has lots of other components as well, maps that are of everything from the trips that the President of the United States has taken to every congressional election in America from 1840 to the present, to the overland trails, all created from diaries, to a map that shows the foreign-born population of every county in the United States from 1850 to the present, with exactly what country contributed those people to the United States. American Panorama uses these really sophisticated techniques to make really beautiful maps. I don't make any of them. I just say, wouldn't it be cool if we had this? And my 3 colleagues at the University of Richmond have figured out ways to make them. We're going to focus on 2 of those a little bit later.
So I didn't know if you wanted to answer a question someone asked about the collections that you were showing a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Do students and teachers need to set up individual accounts to make a collection?
I'll let Annie answer that.
Yep. So we have it set up 2 ways because we know that some of the students, we have lessons or learning resources rather that we've developed for students as young as 4th and 5th grade. And so as teachers, we know if they're 13 or younger, we don't allow them to send out any personal information like an email account. So what we have is the teacher can create what's called an assignment. And let me go back up and navigate to the menu there. In the menu, a teacher can either curate their own resource or they can put together 2 or 3 and push it out to kids with an assignment code. For older students, then you can, if they're old enough to be allowed to use email, and some schools use Gmail accounts as a Google login, even though they don't have the email part activated. So it really depends on how your school has their technology configured. But as a teacher, you can create an assignment and push it out with a code, just like you would for a lot of other web-based tools, or you can have them create a collection if they're allowed to get on email. So we tried to make it as user-friendly for as many different age groups and also within the parameters of what your school would allow them to do, if that makes sense.
So you can see why we have Annie, who actually understands all those constraints. It's not just make something cool, but something that will actually work.
And the other thing that they can do without really, which I think is really fun, like a very quick thing, is if they just find an interesting connection, they can also share that and they can just copy that. So that would copy the code. They could paste that into the chat box. If you're teaching remotely, they could paste that into a Google Doc to share with a classmate or their teacher. And that way they could even, that way they could make a Google Doc and then they could put their comments about those 2 articles and what they found interesting about that connection. So that's a third way to get around the email situation with younger learners.
So one of the things that I perhaps should have said at the beginning, this is all free, where the whole idea is for everybody to be able to use this as they know best in their own classroom. There's far more than anybody could possibly use, and it's going to be constantly refreshed and renewed every year. But the things that we do present will endure. So if you find a really great article from one year you want to use for the next, it'll still be there for the next one. And because, so we have print, and then we've had maps. We also have video. This is the PBS series that I host called The Future of America's Past. And as we'll see later, Annie has made teaching guides for all this. I see somebody from the Park Service, and so this is Fort Monroe, where the first African people were brought, but also where slavery began to end in the contraband decision. And on the right, Barbara Johns, who basically led her high school in revolt in order to help create Brown v. Board. 1951, and there's a museum there and we visit. So we think that your students will enjoy. These are less than 30 minutes, and so they're topics from Japanese American incarceration to American Revolutions, Texas before the Alamo, to Chicago in 1919. So and you can use segments within them. And then there's backstory, the podcast that I did for 12 years. We just wrapped it up about 3 or 4 weeks ago. But the good news is that we have the entire archive, which is probably over 1,200 segments about every part of the American past. And that we are weaving these into all the sources as well. So it's a fourth medium. If some kids would enjoy listening to it on their phones, on the bus or whatever, it's a kind of a portable way to learn about history.
Okay, so the learning resources, as Ed mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and escape out of here and take you to a live site so we can really look at a few more of those. So again, we tried to make this as user-friendly for teachers. Really, this is a teacher-facing page. I wouldn't really expect a student to go here. But we tried to make it so you could search by topics. So there's a pull-down menu there. I tag, similar to the way that we have Bunk with lots of tags, we have lots of tags within the learning resource ecosystem as well. We also tried to Lexile the content on all of the learning resources. So I actually make 2 of everything. We have the teacher version, which has the standards. So you could also search by the types of standards that your state follows. We don't do individual state standards simply because there's 50 different ways to do that, and it would be almost impossible to keep up with 50 different standards revision calendars. But we go with all the major national ones, and so depending on which ones you're looking for, you can also find a learning resource to match that. And then we tried to think of different types of learning strategies. So if you're trying to teach something with civil discourse, here's some of the types of learning resources that we've tagged in with that, collaboration techniques, critical thinking, and these lists are continuously expanding as we are adding new resources and tagging in those different types of activities. The most recent ones are always going to be here in the trending with teachers, but then you can expand the library. It is growing all the time. So here's just one sample that you can see here, electing the House. This is in edit mode because I'm allowed to edit it. But we also have a student version. So when you go out to the student version, it looks very different. It's navy blue. So that is kind of a visual cue for you as the teacher, like, yes, this is the student version. No standards, no teacher directions, because kids don't need that. They just want to get straight to the heart of it. So we tried to, again, make it as easy to navigate, as easy to find, so that kids will want to go there, you'll want to use it. You can use all of the resource, or you can just pick out a part that you think would be the most helpful to you. And we're going to look at some more of these later.
Yeah, we're going to actually show you how to map inequality with these. Yeah. And then finally, we have a brand new component to New American History podcast with Kadada Williams that looks at the story of emancipation from the viewpoint of the African-American people who actually lived it, using quotes from the time to basically make like a news show, but it's being reported from people who are putting their families back together, or meeting the Freedmen's Bureau, or building churches and schools. And so we'll have it'll be an 8-part series that'll be out in November. And so we're really excited about that. And Annie will be making teaching resources to go with those as well. So Reconstruction, in my experience, is one of the hardest things to teach. I always joke that it happens over winter break, or between volume 1 and volume 2. But we're going to explain it in a way that I don't think people have heard it explained before. It's going to be great, and Kadada is tremendous. So Annie would like to give you a quick poll.
Yep, Laura's going to actually push that out, I hope, to the screen.
Here, we're just curious which of these on first glance looks like what you would be most interested in using. And this is just so we can keep making more and of what you think might be most helpful. A real horse race there. It's great to see that different ones are getting more. I find that, being a teacher, I can have my feelings hurt by anyone that doesn't come in first. but be happy for all that, that do well. So great.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and end polling. So if you're going to vote, go ahead.
All right. Look, good. The maps barely win the teaching resources. All right. So the maps really are remarkably cool, as you're going to see a little bit later. So thanks very much for that.
All right. We looked at forced migration a little bit. Is there anything else we wanted to look at on that, Ed?
No, I think let's get into the current.
Yeah, I want to get to the main event. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Can everybody see that on the screen?
So I would have to say that this is our most widely used project at American Panorama, the Digital Scholarship Lab. And it's really pretty amazing. I can say this because, again, I didn't make it, but it maps redlining in every city in the United States where that took place, which is a remarkably large number of cities. It's all those places. And you can see, it's very heartening to see that so many of you are coming from around the country. And as you can see, there's hardly any part of the country that didn't undergo redlining. And what redlining is when in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Association worked with, or corporation, the federal government worked with local real estate agents and banks to try to encourage homeownership. But by doing so, they came in and mapped all these cities and determined where were safe places for banks to give people loans. And the tragedy of this is it became a self-reinforcing story in which people who did not have property, did not have wealth, found themselves disadvantaged even more. But in the kind of way that historians like, at least it created a remarkable record of what every city in the country was, how it was, the landscape of it. Annie, do you want to take us maybe to?
Yep.
Take us to Chicago, okay? And you know, when you go to Mapping Inequality, it will know where you are if you want it to be. And you'll see the areas by grade, and what it does is it's where the best people, these are not areas, this is what they call people, live. And here a description of what each part of it is. And it's all color-coded into the map of the present and of the past. And it will tell you all about all the people who live there. I just did a presentation of this for my own city to a nonprofit board to show the origins of the current patterns of poverty where we live. And it takes people's breath away to see how deep this systemic inequality ran and how much it was endorsed by the federal government and how much it was, and just how close to the surface racial stereotype and racial injustice lay. So Annie's showing you that some of the different components of it. You can search for any city and you'll see there in the city what percentage of the land was just rendered definitely declining, or what's best. And one of the things about this, I do think that people, I think maybe the George Floyd killing has reminded us that every part of the country has its own burden of race and inequality. And he's showing us Seattle, where people are focusing now about the protests and so forth. And so this is great because all of the idea of American Panorama, as I said from the very beginning when I first imagined this, I want every person in every classroom to be able to see themselves in American history. So here you can go to the nearest city where you live and people will recognize neighborhoods and be able to see, you know, this is the Negro area of Seattle, it says, but you'll see that the disparaging and things that people are saying have real consequences. So that's Mapping Inequality, and it focuses on the 1930s right up to 1940. These very same patterns were the ones, these same maps were the ones that were used after World War II when the United States invested lots of money in home ownership and giving mortgages to service people and so forth. And what you can see here is the ways that the inequality amplified. And we can see the origins of a lot of the debates today about reparations and so forth, about wealth building, that African-American people basically had no chance to build wealth because they were systematically discriminated against. So that's mapping inequality. Addie was showing you some of the features of it. You can spend a lot of time in this, if you like, because we've managed to harvest all of these, every primary source. It's useful too because students can really see how it is that history is created from primary sources and how we would know. Now, Annie's showing you the learning resources. Maybe you'd like to talk about them, Annie.
Yep. So again, this is in teacher view. So we've got your vocabulary, and then we always try and include teacher tips, things that will guide you if this is not something that you've taught before, or things that we've come across that we found useful when we're describing this to folks. And then we also I use a lot of screenshots with step-by-step directions, so students will be able to follow along in the student view as well. So that everything is very clearly marked, and kids will be able to see step-by-step what they need to do or where they need to go next. So when they're on the map live, and one thing that I really encourage kids to do is maybe, obviously right now we can't do this with social distancing, but in a perfect world, they would be able to kind of buddy up with a partner. One person might have the map open. So let's say they're looking at Memphis, and then the other student would have the directions, the learning resource up on their screen, and then they could work together and follow those directions and then follow along on the map with the other screen. So that's just one way to do it. You could still do that with kids. Some kids are able to share screens, or if they're working remotely, they could have two tabs open. One, kind of what I'm doing here, and they could toggle back and forth between the directions and the screen, because we're all adapting to this situation with the kids teaching remotely and working remotely. So we're actually going back and modifying the directions on a lot of the learning resources, and all the new ones that we've made this summer and that we're moving forward, we're going to actually embed some language about how you would adapt this for remote learning. So we have about 12 that we have been working on this summer that we'll be pushing out in the next few weeks that will have specific directions on how you can adapt this learning resource for remote learning.
And part of the idea is, obviously, we didn't imagine all this with the pandemic in mind, but having these native digital sources really takes advantage of the situation in which we're in which people can actually use the computers in which we're camped out in front of so much to actually make it more interesting than just reading a printed document on a screen. So this is the other major source that we are using to map inequality, and this is renewing inequality. This is basically about urban renewal. And I think you know that people at the time called it Negro removal, and that it amplifies the injustices that were first created in redlining. Then it is when all the interstates are driven through the middle of our cities. This is how this came about. So you'll see that it has some of the same navigation techniques. It has the same, and this is every city that had urban renewal. And you'll notice that most of the places that have urban renewal are small. I think people imagine these as only being large cities, but instead, all kinds of places wanted to have the interstate go through the middle of them. And so Annie is showing you here some different capacities of the renewing inequality. And you can see that it allows you to toggle back to the redlining maps so that students can actually see the connections between decisions that were made in the 1930s and then their consequences or amplification in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So you assume that all your students will understand where the interstate highways are and understand, okay, this is a major feature. Those weren't always there. And why are they where they are? And I think here you can see on this map that the interstate highways here in Chicago are going through the red areas that are labeled in the lower right-hand corner as hazardous. And you can click on, as with all our maps, we show maps, but we also show other forms of visualization, like histograms on the right. And there's almost always something that you can toggle and see more of, something that we know that students really like. Annie, you want to talk about how you use these?
Yeah, so one thing that I really like about the team that builds these maps is they also build in a lot of good features in terms of explaining to kids. So in this case, they've also got videos embedded in. They've got a little description here of, you know, just what was going on at that time period, how urban renewal worked, images. So it's got everything you need right there embedded in the map. And this is done with, if you're familiar with GIS story mapping software, Justin, who creates this portion of the map, does such a nice job with this. So you've actually got a story map embedded right there in the live map so that they don't have to keep going out back, you know, to 3 or 4 different sources. So it's such a rich resource. There's so many different ways that you can use it. And then of course you can still go back to the live map very quickly. So I think that this is one that doesn't get used as much as the redlining one, because people are Googling or searching for the term redlining, but I find this to be just as important of a resource. And then some schools actually offer GIS courses, and so they also include all the files you need. So if you're actually if you have an ArcGIS for school, EdConnect's free account for your school, then you can also, you and your students can go in and pull those files down. The kids can make their own maps. Maybe they just want to focus in on their own neighborhood. And so I just find this one is one that doesn't get used as much, which is a shame because I really think it should. I also think a lot of times, there's the data again, you can download. I think a lot of times we tend to go for the things that are in the news or the things that appear to be, I don't want to use the word trending, but yeah, they're trending. So redlining has been discussed in the news quite a bit in the last several months, but I think that relating it back to kind of what happened, the second half of that is equally important. And also for your civics, your government, then they also have embedded quite a bit of data in here about the civic piece. So all the legislation and the history of that. So if you're a government teacher, you can also, this map has something for you as well. So I just think it's a rich resource. We do have a new learning resource that we're in the middle of working on. So I think maybe once that's out, it'll kind of prompt people to use this one, hopefully as much as they use the original Mapping Inequality.
There's a couple of questions if you want to take some of them now. Okay. There were some questions about the resources and data that are available under the downloads and data. Did you already show that?
Yes, I just was showing that.
That's where it was. Okay, I thought so.
Yep.
Okay. And then there was a teacher who, Chris was wondering, where can she find resources for Latinx students? My classes are predominantly Hispanic, and redlining formed the communities those students live in, and they find mostly resources relating to African Americans.
So if you go into, I'm just going to click here. When you are going through those area descriptions, I'm going to go ahead and search. She didn't say what city she was from, did she?
Chris, you can type.
I'm just going to pick Dallas because I was talking to somebody from Dallas earlier today. So if you go into the different area descriptions, then you can read the remarks. And so if a student is living in an area that was included in these maps, you know, it's kind of like the first time a kid goes on Google Earth, they search for their own house first, right? I mean, that's just what they do. And so the same thing, they can search for the city where they live or where their school is, and then they can drill down and see if their neighborhood was included in there. And then they can kind of look at the area descriptions and comb through those and look at the different remarks that were being made. And different parts of the country definitely are going to have different descriptions. And I'm just going to say racist comments are all throughout these descriptions. And I think teachers and kids are equally shocked when they see these are official government documents, and this is what people said and what they thought and how they rated and how they decided who did and didn't get a loan based on the comments. And The cities are 40,000 or higher in population. So a lot of times when we're looking at these maps, I get asked questions, why isn't my city on there? And I think Ed mentioned earlier, almost every state has some, except for the area near like Montana. I was working with a teacher from Montana earlier this week, and he said, we're never on anybody's map. But
hey, Annie,
it's not densely populated.
Could you please go to foreign born and to show?
Sure.
As you do it, I'll talk a little bit. So this is the map that is has the origins of every person in the census from 1850 to the present by county. It's actually one of my favorites, and I think it's one that is most immediately appealing to people. So as you can see, all these are American panorama, and he's clicking very efficiently through this. So if you go to click on any county inside the United States, and when you do, and so that's for 2010 Guadalupe, Texas, it sends out the tendrils to where in the world the people were born. Here you can see it's Mexico, but ironically, here in 2010, Germany is still second in Philippines. So you can choose another date and to see how this would have changed from an earlier period. See Annie's moving the cursor across the bottom. And so people can see how the population of Latinx people has really changed over time. You can go to a country of origin as well and then show where people come from. So it's pretty amazing amount of data on that, and really beautifully done, I think, that allows people to understand really just how the complex fabric of American life and how immigrants have made the nation from its beginning. So if you clicked on Mexico at the top there, Annie, where you on one of the maps where you were, actually go to an American county that has people from Mexico right there, and then
Canada.
Yeah, but well, go ahead and click on Canada.
Okay.
Anyone, Italy.
Yep.
No, one of the maps on the bar chart. You can't read my mind. What's wrong with you? And so you click on that, and it shows you where people from Canada lived in the United States. So if you wanted to see where people from Honduras lived in the United States in 2010, it'll show you. So just I understand what you're saying about inequality and the way that Latinx kids might not be able to see themselves in the 1930s in some cities, but these are bridges that people can understand the way that things are moving now.
There was another question about the census numbers being low this year. Oops. Can you hear me? The census numbers being low this year due to the pandemic. Is there a way to map districting for education when the numbers may change due to low census numbers or the exclusion of migrant numbers?
Yeah, and that will, being history, it'll take us a little while to do that. But what this does allow us to show, because you can zoom into each county in this regard, and to show how these patterns are not new. 1870 census neglected maybe a very large percentage of Black people coming out of slavery. And so the analogy, now there's a case where going to Bunk would allow you to look at, so maybe Annie, you can do a search for census, and we can just sort of see how the census has been a topic of concern, and see how many. So there's a history of the census, the evolution of the census, and show you how it changed from 1800. And there's the, you go to the articles, how racial data gets cleaned. So there you can go and show how students were as early as the early 20th century, how this is all working. So all that's a way of saying yes, maybe not on the maps themselves, but on the discussions of maps, which of course then can cycle back into the different form. And Backstory has episode about the census as well. So there's different ways that you'll be able to see about this. I like answering the questions. So Annie, are we ready to go to questions, or is there, you
let's see, we've gone through, I just want to make sure we don't, I did link some additional resources that go along with the redlining. So you've seen the map, you've seen the learning resources I did. There's Renewing Inequality. There's also a list that I just call it additional resources. And basically, I'm just curating links, mainly for the cities that did not perhaps make the map. And this is just a straight up Google Doc, and I encourage you to email me if you find things. People are saying, like, I want to get started, I don't know where to start. So these are some quick links. But a lot of times, like Washington, D.C., people are always saying, why isn't Washington, D.C. on that map? That's a great question. Rob Nelson, who is the director of the group that makes these, he says that there are many people that think there actually was a DC map, but because it was such a political place, being the nation's capital, that they somehow scratched it. He's still hoping that somebody will find it in the Library of Congress at some point. But there are other cities, like where I live in Charlottesville, that weren't 40,000 or over in population, but there are now people crowdsourcing their own maps using this same, type of data. They're looking at this map as a model, and then they're creating their own by pulling local records. When do we get paved roads? When do we get electricity? When do we get running water? And that's how they're kind of recreating, who were the haves and have-nots, their own redlining map. So that all those links are embedded in here. So when you get the link, Laura, did you already put the bit.ly in there for them so they can take the slides?
Yes, I need to get it again.
Yeah.
Because some people came in.
Very quickly reminding people that, the legacy of redlining, of course, we're seeing now with the pandemic, it's not just housing, but it's income level, it's healthcare, food deserts. If you don't live close enough to go pick up a prescription, if you don't live close to a grocery store, you're eating a lot of food out of convenience stores or dollar stores. And so, Ed, do you want to just briefly show these maps?
Yeah, so this is a book I have coming out in November that has 80 maps that try to map all American all migration in the South of African-American people, white people, indigenous people, and immigrant peoples across time. And so this is one that we made 2016 that shows, this is before the pandemic, of where the areas of poor health are. And you can see this is a pattern that of African-American and Appalachian. If we go to the next one, what you'll see is that maps pretty closely onto family income below poverty level. And if you remember the map that we showed you before of forced migration, it's bone chilling to think about how much the poverty level at the end of the 21st century, at the beginning of the 21st century, is prefigured by that of the slave trade. And but of Appalachia, my native region, you can see that it's there of sort of deindustrialization. So this is the first map we made of the COVID crisis. And what you can see is the kind of cross-hatched areas there are areas that were more than 40% African-American. And you can see how quickly the crisis descended on the rural South. And this is in April. And of course, we know what the map looks like today. And what you can see there is not only the enduring power of the racial inequalities that were formed by slavery, but also the policy implications of what happens if you do not use public policy to stem the pandemic. And so the book's out in November, but they let me get this map in because it's such a enduring symbol of the power of migration and of injustices of the past are still alive today. So we have one more poll, and then the rest of our time will be questions. So be forming some good ones. The title of my book is Southern Journey, The Migrations of the American South, 1790 to 2020. Somebody really did ask that. I'm not just mentioning that in this time.
Okay, I think, Laura, you've got the first one up again that we did. You should have poll 2. Right? Didn't we already do this one?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to hit launch polling. I didn't hit launch polling.
Although it might be interesting to do the other one now that they've seen the other one.
Yeah, that's true.
So if you look at this, contested landscapes about, well, you can see the monuments and memorialization, civil discourse. So we're making these all the time meant to be useful. So let us know what you think would be. You're not being helpful because you're saying that they would all be good. And actually, we will do all of these. So
They're actually all in the queue. I just need to know which ones do I need to try and push out faster.
Yeah, so monuments and memorialization is something, I'm in Richmond and very involved in a lot of these debates and issues about what should be done with the various monuments and so forth. So Annie, I think we might want to go ahead and see what questions people have. So thank you very much for the poll. We appreciate that. So Laura, do you want to direct some questions to us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One of the questions had to do with the mapping and whether it included contemporary gentrification patterns.
Well, no, not in the maps themselves, because they are historically focused on urban renewal and then on redlining. But it is, Annie was showing that one of the things about these whole projects is we refer to them as a Swiss Army knife. You can use them to say, okay, students, we have this map now where urban renewal went. Let's look at GIS information now, or just look at the newspaper or online, or your own experience, what areas are gentrifying. So since all these are basically transformations of historical information into different media, because we are historians and we think it's important to, if we don't do it, nobody else is. People who are looking at current issues might not have any interest in going back and seeing how this would tie into the early 19th century. We feel like our contribution to all this is to showing the underpinnings of the situation today. All that's an elaborate way of saying no, but it can really connect to the things about gentrification today.
Annie, do you want to go ahead and stop sharing? And that way they can see Ed when he's answering the questions. So there was also a question about reservations. Does it show relationships on the maps to Indian reservations?
Trying to think of the maps that we showed tonight about mapping inequality and teaching inequality are urban, and so that they don't have those on there as well. There's a great deal about in the new book, which I'm sorry it's not available now, but it will be this fall. We're also making story maps so you'll have access to it, all about indigenous peoples at every stage from the beginning of the 19th century to the present. So we will have maps about that very soon.
We also have a lesson in the queue on the Trail of Tears, and we also have one that goes along with the Transcontinental Railroad that will touch on some of aspects of American Indians and the way that we always talk about how we see them pop up at Thanksgiving, and then we put them in a box on a shelf, and then they don't come out again until certain other times of the curriculum. But what kids don't understand is, a lot of kids just think, oh, Native Americans, really after the code talkers, they never ever hear anything about a Native American again anywhere in their curriculum, which is ridiculous. So we're trying to, in that learning resource, talk about, stop putting people in boxes and only teaching them on certain holidays, teaching everyone's narrative and including everyone in history. So that lesson that's coming out, both of those, I think will kind of get to that point so that kids will see themselves in the lessons.
And in the future of Richland's Past, there's an episode about Texas before the Alamo, which is a lot about indigenous people. There's an episode about the Transcontinental Railroad in which I talked to a Shoshone leader about his own people's experience. And there's an episode about the American Revolution in which I talked to a representative of the Mohawk Nation about there. So what Annie is saying is true. In the future episodes, we make a real effort to show every topic from multiple perspectives. And so there's quite a bit of indigenous history in there. Okay.
There's actually also one learning resource that's already in there that is for teachers. It's actually designed to be used with pre-service teachers or in-service teachers that kind of gets to that point. And it's embedded with some resources from the Smithsonian, the Native 360 project, that talks about how do we talk about indigenous populations and how do we embed them in the curriculum and not leave them out. And so that's one that you could use in a PLC, or you could pull elements out of that website to use with students as well.
So there is some interest in having you share the links for the COVID maps. I don't know if will those be in the slideshow? Yeah,
so if you have the bit.ly, you'll have the map. Everything that you saw tonight on the slides There's a couple of slides we didn't get to that had some examples of new scholarship. But basically, now they're taking a look at, some of you may have seen the Opportunity Atlas. So where you live basically is predicting you're almost like fated to have a certain type of life or a certain economic status. And then the idea behind that atlas is that you would, you know, what could we do? What changes could we make so that that's not a self-fulfilling prophecy just because you're born that zip code? And so now our guys at the Panorama Lab are working with some other folks to link the redlining map to the Opportunity Atlas. They're still kind of in the planning stages, but I threw a couple of slides in there just because I thought that was really interesting scholarship to keep an eye out for too.
And Chris wanted to know, Ed, based on your knowledge and scholarship, what's the relationship between redlining and university expansion, such as in Durham, Richmond, Charlottesville, and town-gown relationships? And are there other examples that you can think of?
Yeah, it's a complicated and kind of sad story in the sense that a lot of times colleges and universities have grown at the expense of distressed neighborhoods. And for all as much as I love these institutions where I've spent my life, they don't add to the tax coffers. And so they're a kind of mixed blessing. So, you know, colleges and universities, especially urban ones, are often growing where land is least expensive, which is where people with the least means live. So that would be a great question that people could explore using the maps that we have, looking at where the colleges and universities in their cities are and how exactly where they've expanded.
Sounds like a great assignment for Chris. Chris Bunin. He knows how to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's one reason I say it with such confidence.
I'll tell him that's what his students have to work on in September. We'll get him on that right away.
So a more technical question, are most of the resources compatible with accessibility tools such as Snap and Read and Google Translate?
So I'm so glad someone keeps asking that question everywhere we go, because we're working really hard to try and figure out workarounds. So for example, Bunk, when you're reading something in Bunk or a description from inside the map, what I have found is a workaround for now. We do not have immersive reader built into any of these tools yet or anything like that. But what you can do is you can paste the area description or you can paste the text into Wakelet is one that I've found that's a free tool. So if you put the link to the article in Wakelet, then Wakelet now has immersive reader built in. And so for students that need that, they need that audio or that read aloud feature, that's one workaround that I've been using this summer. My goal is to hopefully someday it will work on all platforms, but we're still trying to think that through.
And if you go to Backstory, you can both hear the narration and read it as well, and control the pace of the narration with the transcript.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. So another question has to do, and this will probably be about our last one because we're getting close to time, but how do you work with other disciplines like sociology, economics, etc.?
So we showed a few civics and government examples. For the civics and government folks out there, there's a terrific learning resource in our resource library that was done with the Washington Post. Joanne Freeman wrote a piece for Made by History, and it talks about why historians at this time are particularly helpful in helping us unpack what's going on with the current political climate. There's also a map called Electing the House that we didn't have time to show you tonight because it was kind of off topic, but it's one of my favorites. And again, using census data, has all of the US House of Representative elections, and you can drill down to your individual voting district. So that is one way. We've been doing a summer-long institute at University of Richmond with teachers from all different content areas. And this year the theme was redlining, but that extra list that I showed you, it has links out to how people have expressed their thoughts or reactions to redlining through art, through music, through poetry. And so we've got books in there, you know, reading materials are embedded in that extra list of resources. So if you go back to that slide that said additional resources, every time I find anything else that I think you could use, and if you guys find one, just email it to me. I am every day adding to that list I find.
And I would say much of Bunk is actually sociology, economics, civics. And so we mean it to be kind of a lingua franca. Anybody who's thinking about society, it all has a historical angle, but it is engaged with all those other disciplines.
All right, I'll squeeze one more in since we started a minute or two late.
Okay.
There's a question about specific resources that highlight the historical thinking skills of causation, contextualization, periodization, continuities, and so forth. Do you have some specific part that specifically works with those?
Well, we try and embed some of that in everything that we do. Again, I go back to that slide that had the kind of why we're doing this. So I would say probably well, I think that the redlining one does do a pretty good job with that, kind of laying out, you know, what was happening at that time period and what the impact is today. I think the Shirley Chisholm one that we just put out recently, it goes into topics talking about things like intersectionality. That one, the Joanne Freeman one, also goes back and looks at the elections and what the previous patterns were, and then bringing it up to today. So I think that we try and embed a little bit of that in almost all of them. Ed, are there that you can think of?
I would end with all my little screeds, my little essays on the home pages of the editions are all about that history. The brand new one we just posted yesterday is History's Not a Formula, in which I rail against the whole idea of the Civil War as industrial versus agrarian. No, it wasn't. It was about slavery, but it was an evolving story. So everything that we're doing, I will make this our final rousing conclusion. Everything that we're doing is designed to take history apart so that people can put it back together again, to see all the moments of contingency, how nothing was predictable, but everything is connected. You know, somebody referred to what we're building as a contextualization machine. I feel like, you know, a lot of the tendencies in history education are toward freezing things, toward reducing things, toward oversimplifying things. What we're trying to do is to enliven things. That's what this is really all about, so that people can see themselves in the past, they can see the past moving, and they can see the past connecting. So we're really grateful for this chance to connect with all of you folks tonight. Don't want to infringe upon your time. I would do this for hours. Maybe we'll have another opportunity, but I'm such a fan of NCHE, all the things that you're doing. You can see how lucky I am to be associated with Annie, who is such a force. But what this means is that what we want to be is of service. We're just doing all this to be of help. And we know that everybody needs some help this year. And so let us know how we can help. We're there at the other end and trying to give you things that you can use to make your job more satisfying and for your kids to have memorable experiences with history.